Good afternoon, my name is Davide Maggioni and I work at the University of Milano Bicocca in Italy and at the Marine Research and Higher Education Center in Faafu Magoodhoo, Central Maldives. And today I would like to give you an overview about the research on hydrozoans that has been conducted in the last 10 years or so at the MaRHE Center in Faafu Magoodhoo. So hydrozoans are members of the phylum Cnidaria, which is currently composed of 6 classes, among which anthozoans and hydrozoans are the most diverse. Hydrozoans belong to the group called Medusozoa, meaning that they possess a medusa stage, contrary to, for instance, scleractinian corals. Hydrozoans are aquatic organisms, and most of them live in a marine environment, so there are about 4,000 species, and only 40 or 50 species have colonized fresh water. This is the typical life cycle that we find in hydrozoans. So there is a larval stage, the planula, there is the polyp stage, which is normally colonial, and then there is the medusa stage, which is generally planktonic, and it's the sexual stage. This is the current classification for hydrozoans. So there are 2 subclasses, Hydroidolina and Trachylina, and this classification has been also confirmed by phylogenetic studies. Here on the right, you can have a look at the general anatomy of the polyp stage. You have on the left the Anthothecata and on the right the Leptothecata, which are the most diverse orders in hydrozoans. So why study hydrozoans in the tropics and in particular in the Maldives? First of all, we know that coral reefs are biodiversity hotspots, and hydrozoans are no exception to this pattern. So there are several tropical hydrozoan species. And also we know that hydrozoans play very important ecological roles in this environment, both in their benthic stage, so the polyp stage, for instance, for bioconstruction, but also when they are pelagic, so the medusa stage, they play important roles, for instance, in the food webs as predators or prey. And as we'll see later also, they are involved in several symbiotic associations, so they have ecological roles also in this sense. Until a few years ago, hydrozoans were largely understudied in the Maldives. Until 2012, only four papers were available on hydrozoans in the Maldives, and they were mostly faunistic surveys, so list of species. Anyway, starting from about 10 years ago, we started to study hydrozoans at the MaRHE Center in Faafu Magoodhoo, focusing on the diversity, the ecology, and the evolution of this group. This is a brief summary of the methods that we use. So we generally use an integrative approach, meaning that we collect samples to study them in the lab using microscopy, so stereolight and scanning electron microscopy, but also fluorescence assays. But also we perform genetic analysis, so we use DNA to study the diversity and the biogeography and the evolution of these organisms. And of course, we also perform ecological surveys, visual censuses to study the ecology of these hydrozoans. So from the very beginning, we started to find new taxa, in particular new species. For instance, this is the first species that we described, Zanclia galli, associated with Acropora corals. But also we found new species belonging to other group of hydrozoans, such as the Turritopsoides marei, which is a species named after the MaRHE Center and currently known only from central Maldives. This is another example. This is a sponge-associated hydrozoan, a new species, Zancleopsis cabela. But also we found not only new species, but also new genera, such as the Scudacorine diaphana species, associated again with sponges in the Maldives. Another new genus that we described was Pseudozanclia, in this case associated with octocorals and sponges, as we'll see also later in more detail. These are just some examples that have been already published, but also we are working on several other species that are new to science, such as these very small hydrozoans belonging to the genus Nemalecium. And for this group also we are proposing a new family, which are planning to call Nemalecidae. Not only new species, but also redescription of poorly known species, such as Alopteris verworti, which was described and found only one time in the past, and we found it also in the Maldives, and we redescribed together with several other species belonging to this genus. This is just to show you what we mean with the integrative approach. When we study the diversity, the taxonomy and systematics of hydrozoans, we use different methods. So not only classical morphological studies, but also we perform morphometric analysis, for instance, on specific structures such as the stinging cells. So we use statistical analysis to find possible differences among closely related species. Then in some cases we also use fluorescence because different species show, as you can see from this picture, different green fluorescent patterns. And then of course we use genetics to study, to discriminate among closely related species. We also use DNA-based species delimitation techniques, which help us, especially when the species that we are studying are very similar in terms of morphology. We use genetic data not only to study the diversity and evolution of hydrozoans, but also to have a look at their geographical patterns. And here you have some examples. For instance, here in red you have samples from the Maldives, and these are haplotype networks where we can map the geographic provenance on the genetic data. And we have contrasting patterns, meaning that in some cases Maldivian hydrozoans are quite isolated, such as in this case, or here, or here. In other cases, anyway, they are not really well isolated from nearby localities, such as Red Sea or Pacific Ocean. Then most of our research focused on symbiotic hydrozoans. In this sense, we discovered some new association. This is an example. For instance, in this case, we found these hydrozoans here associated with an octocoral, which is called Bebrice grandicalix, and also a sponge, you can see it here, that covers not only the octocoral, but also partially the hydrozoans. This is a very intimate association, and this three-way association actually also allow other organisms to inhabit the octocoral, such as crustaceans, foraminiferae, entoprocs, and so on. Regarding octocoral associated hydrozoans, we also focused in our researches on a specific species, which is Pteroclava cranfi. Previously, it was thought that there was only one species, but actually, according to ecological and genetic data, we were able to find out that there are at least 3 different cryptic species of Pteroclava cranfi, and 2 of these species live in Maldivian waters. Then we decided also to study more in detail the hydrozoans associated with scleractinian corals. Also in this case, all the hydrozoans associated with corals show a very similar morphology, but actually according to genetics we were able to find at least 9 different possible species that show also different patterns of association with their coral host. For instance, there are generalist species associated with several coral genera, and there are specialist hydrozoan species associated with a single coral genus. And here you can see on the left the phylogeny of corals, and on the right the phylogeny of Zanclea hydrozoans. As you can see, there are 2 generalist species in gray, which are associated with several coral genera, and then there are several other Zanclea species which are associated with a single coral genus. And interestingly, in this case, all the specialist Zanclea species are associated with corals belonging to the complex group. We also decided to study more in detail this association between coral and hydrozoans using histology, and in this case, for instance, we didn't find any immune response in the host coral. But what we found is that in many cases the coral is able to overgrow the base of hydrozoans, creating this microstructure of coral skeleton that surround the base of hydrozoan polyps. We also focused our attention on the symbiosis between hydrozoans and bryozoans in the Maldives. There are several hydrozoan species that are associated with bryozoans in the Maldivian waters. For instance, in this example, we focused on a specific organism, which is Zanclea divergens, associated with Celeporaria bryozoans. And also in this case, we found several cryptic species showing some host specificity, at least in some cases. In general, we are now studying several hydrozoan species associated with bryozoans from multiple points of view, so studying their diversity, but also again their relationship with their host, and also in this case, similarly to what happens in coral-associated hydrozoans, we found that the bryozoan overgrow the structure of the polyps, as you can see here, and this has been hypothesized as a defensive mechanism for the hydrozoans. And on the other hand, the hydrozoan may protect bryozoans from predators. Then we focused our attention also on the ecology of hydrozoans. For instance, we studied the ecological preferences of these species, again Pteroclava cranfi, which is associated with octocorals. And we found, for instance, that this species is mostly found in outer reef, where also the host is found. And despite being associated with different octocoral genera, there is a preference for a specific genus, which is Lobophytum. We also studied in detail the association between corals and hydrozoans from an ecological point of view. And basically, in this case, we found that the symbiotic hydrozoans seem to protect the host coral from predators, including Drupella, so gastropods, and parrotfish, so fish, but also possibly from diseases caused by protozoans, such as the skeleton eroding band. This is another interesting observation that we recently made. This is a nudibranch feeding on hydrozoans living in association with bryozoans. As I said before, these hydrozoans are thought to protect their bryozoans host from predators, but this is not the case, because in this case, this nudibranch is a specialist hydrozoan feeder, so it feeds specifically on the hydrozoans associated with bryozoans. And here we have an interesting phenomenon. In particular, we have specifically that this nudibranch basically feed on the hydrozoans, and also it is able to store the stinging cells in specific structure here called cnidosacs that can be used for defensive purposes. So in conclusion, during the last 10 years or so, we described several new hydrozoan taxa, new species, new genera, and also new families. But of course, we are just scratching the top of the iceberg, because the diversity of hydrozoans in the Maldives is probably much higher than previously thought, of course, but also there are several new species to be fully described and characterized. Regarding the biogeographic patterns, we found some contrasting situation, but of course we need a more comprehensive sampling across the whole archipelago and also nearby areas to better understand the biogeography of hydrozoans. Then we found and described several associations involving hydrozoans. We found that these symbiotic hydrozoans in many cases have cryptic species. We found interesting patterns of host specificity. But also in this case, there is a lot of work still to be done, so several other associations to be fully described in detail using the integrative approach. And finally, we found also important roles of symbiotic hydrozoans in coral reefs. For now, we focus basically only on coral-associated hydrozoans, so we are now extending our studies to other associations, and also we are planning to do experiments in the lab to better characterize this association. So thank you very much for your attention. Unluckily, I'll not be able to be there for questions, but here you have my email, so feel free to write me for any comment or question, and also you can find more on this work in ResearchGate and Google Scholar. Thank you very much.